We're walking through Lent under the theme Carnival. Historically, Carnival meant farewell to the flesh. It was a threshold season, a letting go before entering deeper reflection. But spiritually, Carnival is not about indulgence. It's about naming what we cling to. It's about identifying the ego-driven parts of us that grasp for security, certainty, dominance, and control. Each week during Lent, we're saying farewell to something that keeps us from loving God fully and loving one another freely. And so today, the farewell is this: farewell to maintaining control. Because the flesh loves control, the flesh wants to manage outcomes. The flesh wants clarity without ambiguity. The flesh wants safety without vulnerability. The flesh wants power without weakness. The flesh wants a king who wins. And that is exactly the tension that we heard about in John 18. When Jesus stands before Pontius Pilate, everyone in the story is trying to maintain control. The religious leaders are trying to maintain religious order. Pilate's trying to maintain political stability. The crowd is trying to maintain safety. And Rome is trying to maintain dominance. And Jesus? Well, Jesus is the only one in the room who's not grasping. And in that tense political moment, Pilate takes a question. He asks a question that still echoes. What is truth? That's not curiosity. It's a control question. Because whoever defines truth holds the authority. And before we step fully into that courtroom scene, I want you to think about a crown. Not a gold one, not a jeweled one, not a heavy one. One that's more like a Burger King crown. Flimsy, disposable, almost laughable. But in the first century, the idea of king was not laughable. The idea of king was dangerous. Because in the first century, when Rome heard the word king, Rome heard threat. And to help us feel that question and the tension in the room, we must step into that time and try to realize that there was only one emperor. There was Caesar. Only one ultimate authority. And Rome did not tolerate rivals. So when Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He's not asking a theological question. He's asking, are you organizing a rebellion? Are you challenging Caesar? Are you destabilizing the system? This is political. This is dangerous, and this is all about control. Now it's Passover, and Jerusalem is crowded. And national memory is alive. Liberation from Egypt is being celebrated, and Rome knows this. Pilate has likely reinforced troops. Crucifixions were common during such festivals. The cross was Rome's billboard. Crucifixion said, this is what happens when you challenge the empire, when you challenge Caesar. Cross was never meant to be a beautiful little necklace, a symbol of private spirituality. It was a public execution. State violence on full display. It was a tool of political intimidation and retribution designed to silence the resistance. It was a billboard of terror meant to tell everyone watching, fall in line with the empire or else. And John wants us to see clearly that when Jesus stands before Pilate, this is not about individual salvation. This is a confrontation between two kingdoms. The empire says, control the narrative, control the population, control through fear. And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Not because it floats above reality, but because it does not originate in domination. The illusion of control is that we understand this more than we realize. We live in an age obsessed with control. We track our health, we monitor markets, we scroll breaking news, we curate our public images, we craft careful responses, and yet anxiety has not decreased. See, control is intoxicating. And here's the thing. Control often feels necessary. Because the world can feel like it's spinning, like anger spreads faster than empathy, fear spreads faster than wisdom, and violence is contagious. This is where we have to name something we all recognize. Because it's not just ancient Rome. It's the human heart. It's the world we live in. Violence is contagious. Violence begets violence. A rude look is exchanged for a cold shoulder. A middle finger for a heart torn. Hatred begets hatred. Pick up the sword and die by the sword. You kill us, we'll kill you. There's a contagion of violence in the world, and it spreads like a disease. But grace is also contagious. An act of kindness inspires another act of kindness. A random smile is exchanged for an open door. Helping someone carry their laundry or groceries makes them softer. Randomly paying someone's toll in the car behind you invites them to pay it forward. A single act of forgiveness can feel like it heals the world. And it's not always easy to believe that love is more powerful than hatred, life more powerful than death, and that people can be better than the worst thing they've ever done. Grace begets grace, and love rubs off on those who are loved. There is a contagion of violence in the world, and it is spreading like a disease. And at one time or another, we've all caught it. Through the words we speak, the assumptions we make, the ways we dismiss or dehumanize another. But that is exactly what is standing in front of Pilate. Because Pilate is staring at a man who will not mirror the violence of the world back to the world. Pilate is staring at a kingdom that refuses the contagion, refuses retaliation, refuses to answer threat with threat. Pilate is not asking what is right. He's asking what will keep order. He finds no guilt in Jesus, and yet he caves. Which means the deepest question in the room is not just what will keep order. The deeper question is, what are we going to spread? History gives us moments when people refuse to ask Pilate's question of what is right. Moments when someone reaches a crossroads of moral courage, when they must decide whether to preserve order and keep the peace at all costs, or to risk disruption in order to do what is right. One such moment came in 1963. Martin Luther King sat in a jail cell in Birmingham, and religious leaders had written him a letter urging him to slow down. They said the protests were creating tension. They said demonstrations, they were becoming disruptive. And they said social change, it should happen gradually, quietly, without disrupting the peace. In other words, they were asking Pilate's question, what will keep order? But King wrote back from that jail cell words that still challenge us today. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. And he understood something that Pilate couldn't see. Maintaining order is not the same as doing what is right. And sometimes the systems that promise stability are the very systems that need to be challenged. Now, King didn't respond with violence. He responded with moral courage. He chose love over domination, truth over convenience, justice over comfort. And in doing so, he stood in the long tradition of the prophets and in the shadow of the cross, because the cross itself is the place where empire chose order over justice, because maintaining control mattered more than moral courage. How often does that still happen? We live in a world of competing truths. And here, humility matters. Now, I grew up, when I had hair, I was blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white male, upper middle class. 2 educated parents, both educators. Faith was assumed, stability expected, and systems largely worked in my favor. That's my narrative. My narrative. Ijeoma Olowu is a writer who grew up in Seattle in a single-parent household. She writes about being one of the only black students in advanced classes. She writes about raising 2 black sons and having conversations I never had to have. conversations about how to behave if stopped by police, about how to stay visibly calm, about how not to be perceived as threatening. She describes walking into a store and being followed, being interrupted mid-sentence in professional spaces, carrying the quiet vigilance of assessing whether a moment is unsafe or merely uncomfortable. That is her narrative. When I walk into a store, I don't wonder if I'll be followed. When I see a police car, my heart doesn't stop racing. Different lived experiences shape how we see the world. And spiritual maturity is the humility to say, my story is not the only story. In John 18, everyone sees through their own lens. Pilate sees through empire. The leaders see through temple power. The crowd sees through fear. Each believes their narrative, their truth, has a capital T. But the real truth, with a capital T, stands before them, unarmed. And here's where the cross becomes more than personal piety. The cross exposes how systems operate. The cross reveals what empire does to nonviolent love. The cross is not just for punishment for violent criminals. It's also used to silence political opposition. Jesus doesn't die because God needs blood to calm divine anger. Jesus dies because the empire cannot tolerate a kingdom built on mercy. The cross is what happens when forgiveness confronts retaliation. Inclusion confronts exclusion. Love confronts domination. Rome crucifies to maintain control. And resurrection is God's public verdict. Resurrection says control does not win. Violence doesn't get the final word. Fear does not get to define truth. Love does. The cross is not God's violence. The cross is humanity's violence exposed. And resurrection is God's refusal to answer violence with more violence. And resurrection is God's refusal to not turn away from the truth. That is the truth. And we still see people living this kind of courage today. Not perfectly, not loudly, but faithfully. One of them is Father Gregory Boyle. Greg Boyle is a Jesuit priest in Los Angeles who began working with gang members in the late 1980s. And at the time, his parish sat in the middle of some of the most entrenched gang violence in the city. People told Greg that it was dangerous. They told him it was unrealistic. They told him these young men were beyond saving. But Boyle refused to ask Pilate's question. He did not ask, how do we control these young men? He asked something deeper. How do we remind them they belong? That they are loved? And out of that question grew Homeboys Industries, which now has become the largest gang rehabilitation program in the world. Thousands of former gang members now work there, learning job skills, tattoo removal, counseling, education. But Boyle says the real transformation doesn't begin with programs. It begins with dignity. We're called to stand in awe of what the poor have to carry rather than to stand in judgment at how they carry it. That's what Boyle says. And that is what moral courage looks like. Not domination, not control, but the quiet refusal to believe that anyone is disposable. That is the kind of kingdom Jesus is talking about. A kingdom not built on fear, but on belonging. And yet, if we're honest, most of us live somewhere between Pilate and the cross. We want to do what's right, but we also want our life to stay manageable. We want justice, but we also want things to remain under control. Pilate tries to control because he fears unrest. The leaders try to control because they fear Rome. The crowd tries to control because they fear instability. And sometimes we try to control even because we care. Sometimes we try to control because we fear loss, but control is not love. Love sometimes releases, love sometimes trusts, love sometimes stands unarmed before power and says, I will not become the very thing I oppose. And that's what Jesus does. And now in Lent, it turns the mirror towards us. And we're still grasping. We're trying to control outcomes, trying to control conversations, control how we're perceived, control people we love. Where are we choosing safety over courage, winning over compassion, certainty over humility? The flesh wants to dominate, but Jesus wears thorns as a crown. We want impressive, and Jesus chooses vulnerable. We want victory, and Jesus chooses faithfulness. We want control, and Jesus chooses trust. We want impressive, and Jesus chooses vulnerable. Resurrection vindicates that trust. And so today we say farewell to maintaining control. Not because control is always evil, but because control can't save us, love can. And that is a kingdom not from this world, but it is in this world, and it is for this world. And that is truly good news. And now we start to prepare ourselves to come to the table. And Pilate has asked, what is truth? And so here is the answer. It's not an argument, and it's not a slogan. It's not a weapon. The truth is bread and wine, a body given, a life poured out for you, for me. It is truth you can taste, but it's truth you cannot control. It's truth you can only receive. And at this table, there is no empire, there is no ranking, there is no winning, there is no grasping, there is just mercy. We come with open hands, not clenched fists. We come not to manage God, but to be nourished by grace. And so today, if you're weary of trying to hold everything together, if you're tired of controlling what can't be controlled, if you long for a kingdom built on love instead of fear, come. This is Christ for you. This is truth embodied. This is grace given. And this is love stronger than control. Amen.